I'm not really interested in how people remember what I've made or the dish or the signature item that might have been on a menu. I want to be remembered for the way people felt, the way I've maybe helped somebody come along in their career. Certainly, if I've helped someone in my personal life, for me, those relationships are probably the most important thing at this point.
This is our first episode of in-person recording.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
We are excited to be here from your kitchen.
Yes.
So thrilled to have you as our first guest on our rebranded podcast,
What is it called?
Bolder and Wiser.
Bolder and Wiser.
Love it.
You have a long career in the culinary practice. You work for some of the most prestigious restaurants in the country, including
Jardiniere
in San Francisco, Blackbird in Chicago, and Restaurant Daniel in Manhattan. You've owned your own restaurants too, in Napa Valley in Hawaii. And you've been awarded 6 Michelin stars and a James Beard Award nomination. In 2014, you served as Airbnb's culinary director. 2018, you joined Facebook as the regional culinary operations manager, overseeing their culinary practice and all of Meta's office in the Bay Area. You also fly airplanes.
I do.
We have a lot to talk about today.
Great. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Philip, it's so humbling to hear your background, even though I've heard it before, and I've also heard all the wonderful things about you personally. You've been on what you self-describe as a learner's journey.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned in the last 4 or so years?
For me, going from restaurants where it takes over your whole life, going into the tech side of things and going into corporate catering, then hitting the pandemic when, as someone who works in an operation, the operations literally shut down overnight. It's been a lot of finding my own way through those things, as not only the places I've worked are finding their ways through, but everyone around us has been finding their ways through. For myself, I've been lucky enough that during that time I've met and married a woman named Jean, who is the love of my life.
And that's how we know each other.
That's how we know each other.
We met through Jean, who has
Yeah.
been my friend for years and a business school classmate. And that's how I heard all the wonderful things about you personally, having the total pleasure of being at your wedding.
Yeah. And first of all, what an event. It was great. Brought back kind of my zest for life, right? And kind of opened me up to possibilities that I didn't really know existed. During the pandemic, we built a house together, right? Literally, the two of us built a house. We needed a project when my operations were down, and she came up with this idea to buy a small piece of land. And I went and learned carpentry and plumbing code and all these things that led to building a house, selling it, and going through that whole learning process. I've realized that for myself, really it's about the journey. And I think it's something I didn't understand fully when I was in kitchens. It's the process that I love, right? It's peeling the onion, it's dicing the carrot. It's not the flash of flame at the end that when the pan flips. It is about all the things that go into it. I don't want to fall asleep at this point in my life yet.
Let's go back to the
Sure.
beginning. Tell us a little bit about how your family has influenced who you are as a chef and a leader.
Sure. I grew up in Indiana, right outside of Chicago. My parents were both immigrants. My father came from China. My mother came from Poland. Definitely an odd mix in the 70s, but they had both left their countries to escape communism. And so they had that kind of mutual understanding of the world. My father was a physician. My mother was a chemist. So they were also both in the sciences. My sister is a doctor. My brother is a geophysicist. So it was a family of scientists that were obsessed with food. Growing up, the conversation at breakfast was what's for lunch, and the conversation at lunch is what's for dinner. And dinner was, okay, what are we eating tomorrow?
I have to ask, did you have a favorite go-to meal as a family or as an individual in your family?
I did for sure. My mom on the Polish side learned to make Chinese dumplings.
Did you hand make them?
All handmade. She would make the dough, she'd make the filling, and then my brother and I would play with the dough and ruin it. But my mom and dad would then just fill the dumplings. And it might seem odd, but Polish pierogies are exactly the same thing, just with a different filling. It was absolutely a family affair. In fact, that's one of my greatest memories, and always ask my mom to cook that if we come home.
That's nice. I remember that as a child. I grew up in Taiwan. I remember
Yeah.
lining out on the countertop and then putting in little buns too.
Yeah.
We made the
Yeah.
little buns that
Yeah.
way too.
Yeah. I remember just the lines of dumplings on the
Yeah,
counter,
that's
you know,
cool.
and then they'd freeze some and we'd eat too many probably. And yeah, but food is how my family connected. Yeah, every family has their own way of doing it, right?
Yeah.
My family is also food. It's just
Oh, really?
gnocchis, making gnocchis.
See, that's close to my
So,
heart.
oh,
Gnocchi are one of my favorite.
we'll have to make gnocchis
Yeah.
sometime,
Yeah.
Philip.
The Polish side in me loves anything with potato. Yeah. It's funny. Jean's family, their connection is logistics, right? So they'll talk about, you know, we get to the airport and talk about the bus routes and all these things. And for me, it's funny to hear that. But really, if you insert food into that same conversation, that's how we connected. Went to college thinking I'd eventually go to medical school. Growing up, the questions were not, what do you want to be when you grow up? It was, okay, what's your specialty going to be after medical school? That's what we were asked as kids. And when I got to college, it was eye-opening for me to realize that, you know what, that's not a given. And it's probably not something I really want to do.
How did you discover that?
It was honestly a lot of struggle. Growing up in Indiana, we had traveled a lot growing up. My parents were very into us seeing the world, but we also grew up very sheltered, right? It was the Midwest in the 70s, very wonder years type upbringing. And so when I got to Tufts, we were in Boston and the world was in front of me
Yeah.
with really no one kind of watching over your shoulder. I was focused on everything except school. And it caught up with me. Growing up, high school was, I'm not gonna say it was easy. I didn't honestly put much work in and the grades came. And when I got to college, I thought it would be the same and it wasn't. Now all of a sudden the bar is raised, the people around you are very similar to what you were in high school. And now all of a sudden it's not as easy to stand out. And at the same time, I took a couple classes in anthropology, which I loved, which were the biological side, right? Human evolution, things like that. I really enjoyed it. I dove into it, declared it as my major. And all of a sudden I realized, whoa, there's no more of these evolution classes. Now I got to take all these classes in the cultural side, sociology, things that really I didn't enjoy. And so when I realized that, I was halfway through my degree, I didn't want to start again. So I pushed through, but it took its toll. I was pretty unhappy with it. My parents, to their credit, knew I was struggling. They suggested I take a semester off. When my junior year, all my friends were going abroad to study, as a lot of people do. I actually went and took a couple cooking classes. The cooking classes were in Hartford, Connecticut. So I would go in the morning, I'd drive to Hartford from Boston, cooking classes in the morning, take 2 classes in the evening at Tufts and do that every day for the week. And it was probably 4 or 5 hours of driving total in the middle of my day. But starting with the cooking is when I realized that learning doesn't necessarily mean book study. Learning for me, being hands-on with something, getting to feel the products you're using and holding a knife and seeing the flame on the stove. I'm a much more kind of tactile and practical skills kind of person. And then I'd go back in the evening to Tufts, and with anthropology, not only did I not want to book study, but I was studying how to study. From there, I made it through, to the surprise of many, graduated. So I have my degree. But after college, I'm like, what am I going to do? Need a job. So my brother, just on a whim, suggested, oh, go be a cook. And probably to his surprise, I did. To my parents' surprise, I did. It was a bit of whiplash for them to hear, okay, you're going to college to study eventually medicine, and all of a sudden you're coming out a cook.
And this is in Boston.
In Boston.
And what was their reaction?
I'll give them credit. I was terrified. A
Yeah.
lot of the stereotypes of the strong Asian father and the expectations and all of that were there. I thought that they would be very unhappy. And I'm sure my mother tells me now some of the conversations they had then, but
Between the two of
between
them?
the two of them, it comes down to just fear of the unknown, just not
Yeah.
understanding where I'm going to be,
Yeah.
giving up these quote unquote professional type jobs. What am I going to do with my life kind of conversations? And they were stressed out. And to their credit again, they didn't push that on me. They accepted it. They supported me. And I don't know if surprised is the right word, but it was eye-opening that they could have a different reaction than I thought they might.
I can relate to that
Yeah.
as well. Asian parents who
Yeah.
have very explicit expectations. I think my own observation is that it's a reflection of the fear. They want to minimize the fear because they do know one path works in life.
Yeah.
And when you veer off the path into the unknown, that is not excitement, pioneering work that is into potential risks. And a lot of the anger is a reflection of representation of fear.
What a powerful lesson in leadership, though, from your parents of
Yeah.
walking into that unknown and holding back their own sense of the what if to like really let
Yeah.
you flourish. Just as a parent,
Yeah.
I feel that wisdom
Yeah.
coming from your parents.
Yeah, it
It's
was,
pretty-
I didn't understand it. I didn't have the perspective. When I look back on it, I'm extremely grateful for that. And knowing where they came from, where so much of their life was necessity and doing what they had to do just to survive, to come to this country and provide for their families and give them a better life and an education and all of these things, and to not feel like it was being squandered was a gift I didn't realize they were giving at the time.
So you have this gift.
So I have
And
this
then
gift.
what?
After I graduated, I went and found someone who was in the industry, who was cooking. And I found a guy in Northern Indiana, owned a restaurant called the Strongbow Inn. They did Thanksgiving dinner 365 days of the year. That was what they did as a restaurant. They owned
Oh,
That's
wow.
wild.
It was a turkey farm in Northern Indiana with a restaurant that did that, right? And half the menu was all turkey. Half the menu was fried chicken and very basic middle America type cooking. But he had graduated from the Culinary Institute of America. Two of the people that worked for him had also graduated from there. So I'm like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I want to go learn fast, get my foot in the door somewhere, and let's get this moving, because some people have already been in the industry for years. And I worked for him for free for the summer. He wrote me a recommendation and I got into the Culinary Institute of America, went there and studied, did the first half of the program, learned basic knife skills and all French techniques, things like that. And in the middle of the program, you go and do an internship somewhere. I wrote letters to probably 50 chefs and received one response.
Wow.
See, this is what I love, because this is what's beyond the highlight reel.
Yeah.
And we started out with your impressive background. And most people who probably interact with you or know you just in passing would only know that or
Yeah.
have found you because they are interested in culinary operations. But thank you so much for sharing that, because that is the reality behind so
Yeah.
much of what goes on. So 1 out of 50.
1 out of 50. And at the time it was disheartening, right? But I also applied to the 50 best restaurants in the US, right? Which
Yeah.
probably got 50 letters just like mine.
Hmm.
There was no internet at that point, right? So letters were still a thing. But what I know now that I didn't realize then, a lesson I've learned is you might take it as rejection, but it doesn't mean it's rejection. It's probably more to do with the circumstances that the people that receive that letter are in. You don't know where they are, who they're looking for, what they need, and you might just catch them at the right moment. And quite frankly, I'm probably believe that I caught the one person that saw my letter at the one place that replied at the right moment when they needed someone.
Mm.
So they invited me to come and work for free, which is a
What?
common theme.
Yes. Does this still happen today? Is that still the general practice?
It doesn't happen as much, but in restaurants, when I was coming up, that was a given. At that time, especially at the top places, there weren't as many restaurants as there are now. And so if you wanted to learn, and this was way before food TV, there was no food magazines. There was Julia Child and there was the Frugal Gourmet. That was it. No one knew about cooking. And so the top restaurants had 10 resumes for every one job they had, right? So you did whatever you could to get in the door. And then you are now qualified to be the lowest person on the totem pole. I went and worked for 6 months for free, and it was a struggle. I worked 3 jobs at that point, the main one, and then 2 others on the side, catering and just random things just to make some money for rent.
Wow.
My parents were able to help me a little bit. But after 6 months, I'm looking at going back to school, trying to see, do I want to go back? Maybe I can find another job somewhere that will pay me.
Right.
And Tracy Desjardins, who was the chef at Rubicon where I was interning, had over the course of the 6 months taken a liking to me and put me under her wing, offered me a full-time job, and I jumped at it. And that was the start.
Is that rare?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know someone that I have taken under my wing in the same way Tracy did for me. I'm guessing that's probably something that is somewhat rare throughout humanity.
Corporate
Yeah.
world is
Yeah.
very similar in
Yeah.
terms of it's special when you have someone who's
Yeah.
willing to bring you along.
Yeah.
For sure.
And she personally trained me on all the stations in the kitchen and would bring me to the farmer's market and walk me through everything. And it was like getting a master's degree in cooking at that point. She was, first of all, terrifying, but had become my hero and a mentor and now a friend, right? She was at the wedding after 30 years, right? That's the journey to get to the starting line. And that whole thing is just getting your first step.
At which point did you realize this is going to be my career I will pursue versus this is something I want to do for now and let me explore continuing? I think some of us build careers that are accidental.
I would absolutely call it accident. I think in college, I struggled so much with the academic side of things and theoretical side of learning that once I got in a kitchen, it just clicked. It just made sense. I knew how to hold things and move things around and follow recipes, and just really worked with the way my brain is wired. And I knew instantly, I'm just going to do this and see where it goes. Now, looking back, if I went to carpenter's trade school, it probably would have been the same thing. Or if I learned to work on engines, it probably would have been the same thing. I just happened to go into a kitchen and found my calling. Yeah.
And certainly there was no Meta food program or
No.
Airbnb
No.
food program that you could aspire to
Yeah.
at the time. When you think about your career journey, what has been your North Star for navigating decisions and turns along the way?
That's one that is probably not changed all that much. With anthropology at college, I got a taste of it and then jumped in. Didn't really think it through very much. The danger there is you're taking a wrong step, or a step that's not going to move you in the direction you may want to eventually go. With my career, it's been similar, right? The next thing presents itself and I just go. I just found it. The journey has been pretty organic that way. I didn't really have a North Star per se. I always talked about owning a restaurant one day. That was the dream that everyone in the kitchen had. It was what we thought of as like the ultimate goal. You can explore your own ideas and put the food you want to cook and have the service and the whole experience that you want to give. But really it was, okay, I've learned this from this person. What do I want to learn next? I'm going to go find whoever's the best at that thing and go learn there. So it was more short-sighted in many ways because it was just what's next. But for me, it turns out that it was really building the foundations and strengthening the weak points. And so it worked out for me that it just happened that way.
You mentioned about owning a restaurant.
Yeah.
Just, how many phases were there between the first job and then let's say I'm going to open my own restaurant?
The first job was Rubicon in San Francisco, and that came from my internship. My internship, I was lost. I got yelled at because I chopped parsley wrong on the first day. I remember it like it was yesterday.
I'm pretty sure I only chopped parsley wrong.
It's the joke that it is probably the least skilled task in any kitchen, right? It's just,
Philip, what are you saying?
What I'm saying is that I thought I walked into failure immediately and was terrified, especially because the people around me, 2 other students went to Rubicon for their internship too. So I had 2 of my classmates next to me and they're talking about, oh, do you put salt in your stock when you're making stock to pull the protein out of the bones? And these conversations I would never even think of. And I looked at myself, I'm like, I don't know anything about stocks. So I just put my head down and went to it, right? I made a mistake chopping parsley on day 1, but I did it better on day 2, right? And I just methodically, slowly went through the process and slowly realized that that conversation they were having about putting salt in stock, as a complete novice, I thought it was some world-changing insight.
Mhm.
But the more I went through it, the more I realized that, you know what, that means nothing. They're trying to impress people by what they're saying. So it was all show and no substance. It was interesting to know at that point, you know what? Don't judge yourself by what you hear other people doing. And that was a realization for me in that moment that really pushed me forward, knowing that at that point, this is something I could really do. And owning a place like Rubicon was not out of the question. So it came early for me when I had that realization and hearing that, and flipping the script from being utterly terrified to seeing behind the curtain.
I could do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
possible.
It's such a great story of overcoming imposter syndrome and
Oh, absolutely.
realizing actually these people don't know what they're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
They
Yeah.
sound
Yeah.
impressive,
Yeah.
but maybe if I just keep going,
Yeah.
I can learn things that they might not know.
There's nothing that you can't learn by putting your head down and doing it, studying it, whatever it may be, and getting discouraged because someone else knows more than you. There's always going to be that someone that knows more than you for the most part. And look at it more as a challenge at that point.
I have a question about that because it does feel to me like you need to be in the environment where you're given the space to learn and come along. And some of these top kitchens, I wouldn't think would be necessarily by default the culture of giving people that space. What do you think was there that set you up for success and being able to put your head down on that journey?
A restaurant by its very nature, the economics of it, just there isn't time to handhold anyone through the process, right? You're thrown into the fire, no pun intended, to sink or swim.
Yeah.
And you have to just figure out how to do things. And when I was a cook, if you couldn't do it in a time frame that worked for the restaurant, you'd have a pretty difficult conversation with the chef. And the next time you were out.
Yeah.
And so I think just the way restaurants run, you have autonomy over what you're given, your space. And to me, that was very liberating because I advanced pretty quickly once I had that aha moment. And I was able to really jump in and push myself to learn, how do you make better potato puree? How do you sear a scallop better? How do you make a better salad? How do you make a better vinaigrette? Like all these things. And because they didn't have time to look over your shoulder, you just did it.
Yeah.
Right. And if the chef was happy with it or the diners were happy with it or the whoever, great. No worries. No news is good news. And especially in an environment like these kitchens, the chefs for sure it's almost like a cult of personality in many ways. They are the person. They're the face. They're the ones on the magazine covers, all of that. But the people around you are the best in the world at what they're doing. If you're in a 3-star Michelin restaurant, that person standing right there next to you can accurately claim that they are one of the best in the world at what they do. Being surrounded by those people probably did more to influence me and my drive and my work ethic and my skills than the chef ever did, because they were being interviewed on TV. They were having photo shoots. They were running the business. They weren't down in the prep kitchen chopping the parsley with us. That kind of accountability of your peers and the ability to look at someone and say, that's not good enough. Let's do this over as a peer, right?
So you would help each other get better.
Absolutely.
That's really insightful because if you're going to hold that kind of standard for peers, it sounds like what you got out of it was helping each other to raise the bar consistently.
I think the people you surround yourself with are going to have a big impact on who you are, who you become, the work you do, and surrounding yourself with. I went into these places thinking, okay, I'm going to go learn from that chef and try to emulate what they're cooking. I didn't even realize that, oh, the other people want the same thing and they're going to be there pushing as hard as I am. And so it's something, again, that I didn't realize. And because of what I wanted to do, I almost backed into surrounding myself with good people. Certainly wasn't intentional on my part. I'm not that smart.
But I think you picked a great place to start.
Yeah.
Almost like it feels like almost that's your college degree by being in Rubicon.
Yeah.
And I'm actually contrasting to the business world where this peer-to-peer feedback, I would say, is not as frequent.
I was just going to ask a follow-up question along those lines, which is, how do you think trust was built across? Because it seems to me like if you're going to meet the standard of multiple Michelin stars and be held accountable for your seared scallop, you need to have a level of trust across your peers that sometimes I think, to
Yeah.
your point, is hard to fabricate in other environments.
Yeah.
Wondering what we can learn from you.
The kitchen's an interesting environment because you have multiple hard deadlines every day. Dinner starts at 5:30. You can't put prepping the scallops till tomorrow. You're under the time crunch. So everybody starts with the perspective that this has to get done, right? We're
Yep.
going to find a way to get it done. And that, I guess, in the old days, would be called the can-do attitude. It's just ingrained from the start in a cook. We lived and died by the clock, not just to get ready for service, but during service. If you wait 20 minutes for your steak, it's pretty miserable, right?
Yep.
So time was always a factor, and we held each other to that. It was a common enemy, and we could circle the wagons around that. I think our professional pride, just we were able to humble ourselves with each other, knowing that I want my potatoes to be better. If you can help me make them better, I want that. And I wish you saw more of that in the corporate side. But what it taught me is that just because someone has authority, like they're a vice president in a company or a director, doesn't mean they're a leader. Leadership is different from authority, and you can find leadership at every level in a company.
Totally agree.
And so my peer that was telling me to make my potatoes better, absolutely leading that team to be better.
But was he also helping you make them better? Or just telling you? I'm curious about that because
I think, so it depends, right?
because there's still,
Yeah.
if you're consciously incompetent, you don't know how to do it, and you're under a deadline, that's
Yeah.
a pretty tough situation to be in.
I think there's two scenarios. There's, you make this so much better than me, show me what you do.
Yes.
And that
That is
it's rare.
Yeah.
But there's also the, that's not good enough. And they walk away because they know you can do better. They
Yeah.
know you already know how to make it better. They're holding you accountable to it. And I remember like yesterday, there's one of Tracy's at Rubicon, first restaurant. One of her signature dishes was a seared scallop on a truffled potato puree with a little truffle butter sauce.
Delicious.
Simple in presentation.
Yeah.
One of the best dishes I've ever made.
Yeah.
And it's based solely on the potatoes. That's the star of the dish. And it's a dish that Joel Robuchon made famous, his potato puree. This is one of the most decorated Michelin-starred chefs in the world. And he made his name with potato puree, mashed potatoes. And the whole process, they're like half butter. They're unbelievable. And we worked for months trying to perfect them just to get them better.
How did they teach you? How was it? Let me show you how it's done.
Yeah.
And then you do it. What was the process like? I'm trying to picture the kitchen.
Unfortunately, in kitchens, there isn't someone there standing by you saying, let me show you how to do this.
Right.
That's a rarity. It's, here's what you're making, make it, right? And then you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Like you're talking to the people around you, like, okay, here's how I do it. Let's get it on, do this, do that, walk you through the steps. And then slowly it's trial and error, right?
Sure.
I made these potatoes, I'm going to say 1,000 times at least, and perfected them, right? To the point where we're going up to service. I'm setting my station at 5 o'clock. I know every person in that restaurant is going to come and taste those potatoes and tell me if they're as good as they were yesterday.
Yeah.
That's the wait staff. That's the bartender. That's the dishwasher. That's everybody. And going back to leadership can be anywhere. Like the dishwasher would call me out as often as the chef, right?
Totally.
Everybody held the standards. And you'd watch this motley crew on the street. You'd cross the street to be away from them. But in their element, they're world class. I wish there was more of that. And in the corporate setting, I do believe there is time and resources to do it, right? I struggle with the fact that it doesn't happen, not just in our kitchens, but across the company. Again, just like leadership and authority are separate, I don't necessarily believe skill allows you to rise to the top all the time either in the corporate setting, right?
It's a subset.
What I'm hearing is two interesting lessons. One is that there's a lot of organizations outside of restaurants that aspire to, we are the 3 Michelin star restaurant of corporation.
Yeah.
I've actually heard those words before. What I'm hearing is that you can't have that from day one with all of the people in your proverbial kitchen, that you have to have a place where trial and error, like if you're just letting people go through the revolving door
Yeah.
really quickly, without that, you're not going to get to the kind of success that you want because you're
Yeah.
going to run out of people. Maybe there's a million people that want to work in that restaurant, then you won't run out, but I'm not sure it's the most efficient. And then the other thing is that there's just this sense of really wanting to impart your wisdom to other people around you, and that great leaders are able to determine, like, when you actually know the answer versus maybe you don't know the answer, and maybe you don't have enough time to show you how that truffle butter is made. Maybe you whisper to the person around at the next station to say, okay, can you maybe spend more time because I'm off to Food Network or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that there's a really interesting piece of leadership wisdom in there about just being very mindful that expecting that perfect thing the first go around is probably not realistic.
I agree. I think it's a process, right? It's an infinite game. It's not about today. It's about the journey and tomorrow and the day after and the day after that.
I'm curious, when you had your own restaurants, how did you run it?
There's some moments I'm proud of and some moments I'm not.
Like all of
I'm a
us.
product of my environment. I came up in kitchens where lots of screaming, lots of yelling. You had solid people around you.
Yeah.
The pressures, the time constraints, all of these things, you were always trying to push to do more. If something wasn't good, it's still 5 o'clock to get set up for dinner. If you got to make it again, now you got to do it over, right? That stress, emotions come out, and the stereotype of the screaming chef is real, right? Because it happened. Now, over time, I think I've become a better manager. There's a lot of those, I don't know, qualities or techniques that I've dropped consciously. I don't want to yell
Sure.
at anybody. I don't want to be yelled at, right? I want people to be treated nice. I want them to be at work enjoying what they're doing. For me, again, it's the chefs I worked for were the most skilled in the world at their craft. Some of the least skilled interpersonal relations, right? And when I mentioned earlier that rising in a corporation may not always rely on your skill, how you work with people, how you engage them, how you inspire them, how you give them context, all of these things are just as important, if not more important, to get that buy-in. It was a tough lesson, right? And there are many times that I failed. I failed myself, I failed my team, I failed my business because I resorted to these kind of lesser skills and in many times made the situation worse. But that's what I knew. And until I was able to see, boy, that wasn't helpful. And now I've put myself in a worse position, whether it be with my team, with my business, my guests. It's not as charming as it might be on television watching a chef yell at somebody.
I'm sure not.
Yeah.
There's
It's not charming
drama.
on TV, is
Yeah,
it?
it's not-
It's
Yeah,
not.
I would
It's
argue
not-
it's not charming on TV
No.
either, but yeah.
We're here talking about becoming bolder and wiser.
Yes.
And it's really interesting to hear you say that you were thinking about being nicer and
Yeah.
creating an environment that people wanted to be in and not yelling, because sometimes that's the bolder move,
Yes.
right? Is to authentically lead in a
Yeah.
way that is unexpected,
Yeah.
given all the people who came before you, and certainly wiser.
Bolder and wiser. Yeah. I'd like to think I'm both. Compared to where I was, probably nowhere near where I need to be. I think as I've evolved my leadership style and really actively worked on it, it's come down to, it's not just the skill, it's how you make people feel. And when people are engaged and they want to push the envelope and be bolder, as a leader, you want to give them that opportunity. And so the freedom to fail is a big one. I think a lot of people are scared to make a wrong move because, oh my God, how's this going to affect my rating or something like that?
It's such a high pressure environment.
Yeah.
Does it mean like when I fail, it means the customer has to wait another 20 minutes? How does that taken up?
Yes. Sometimes that's the end result. But whether it be restaurants or any business or any really interaction in life, for me, mistakes are going to happen. So I could berate the person for a mistake that I myself have been guilty of numerous times, probably in my career. Really, to me, what matters at this point is how do you respond to a mistake, right? Not just with your crew or your team or your business, but with your guest. Mistakes, you wait 30 minutes for your food. It's not the 30 minutes. It's whether you're acknowledged, whether people come over and whether it's apologize or try to make it right. You walk away feeling better about it. You're more forgiving. And the same thing, I think, when you build that trust over time with your team, with the people you're working with, you're going to get better results. You might make a mistake in a moment, right? And yes, whether it's a Michelin-starred kitchen or Meta, every little mistake will some degree impact your business. But over the long term, if you are able to take those and turn them around, turn the situation around for your guests, for your team, it's going to get you further eventually in the long run.
I want to ask about the business of restaurant. Restaurant is a tough business to be in.
Yes.
When you were working in a restaurant that's not yours, how much the business side of things was shared? Was there a goal, like in corporate?
Yeah.
Hey guys, here's our revenue goal. Hey guys, how many tables, how many turnovers, and so on and so forth. How is that being conveyed to the rest kitchen?
None.
Zero.
I feel like that's a disservice. But again, there's not a lot of time. Every restaurant, look, you have a handful of restaurants that are at the top, the world-renowned places that are making money, and the chef has his own cookware line and all of these things. But most restaurants in the US for sure and around the world are on razor thin margins, 5% net. The top one's different, right?
Yeah.
They can charge what they want and people are going to come because they're the artist. It's the Taylor Swift of the kitchen. Meanwhile, there's plenty of people playing in the dive bar with their guitar. There's a lot more of them than there are Taylor Swift. And the same thing in restaurants. The top can do what they want and command the price.
Even the top restaurants, what kind of margin can they expect, roughly?
One of the restaurants I worked at in was one of the top grossing restaurants in the country, and we had probably a 15% to the net. When we saw a P&L and we saw that number, we were literally jumping up and down for joy. In a lot of businesses, 15%, like people wouldn't even want to touch it. You know, most restaurants are on such a razor thin margin, paying one cook an hour to sit and learn the budget. And the money's not there.
Right.
It doesn't make financial, and chances are that person's not going to be around to give you return. They're going to be somewhere else working. So really,
it's interesting because the margin of the business is driving a lot of decisions around how you train, how quickly you turn over, and so on and so forth.
And because of that, it's the stress and not being able to have the culture, right? Not being able to have extra people on the crew. One person, you have one person that does that job. If they're sick, first of all, the culture is you don't call in sick, right? So you're dead. That was it.
Yeah.
That's what we grew up in the restaurants thinking. You're sick as a dog. You're in the restaurant.
Just what you want in your
What you want,
restaurant,
no,
right?
no, absolutely. Yeah. Behind the curtain there's a lot of unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah.
Because of that margin.
Because of that,
actually.
right? And if that person wasn't there, they are dead or in the hospital, then everybody else has to pull up that work, right? There's no one else to fill in. And it's not the healthiest environment to be in. You have a lot of creative outlet. You have a lot of following your passion and the joy of putting out the perfect plate. The sauce falls perfectly on the scallop and the potatoes are the right consistency to give you that perfect swirl. It's like chasing the dragon, right? It's like a drug. But the flip side of that is because you can't hire extra people. If you're the chef, you're there open to close. Plenty of days where I walked out of there at 1 a.m. and was back at 6.
So when you opened your first restaurant, what was your expectation?
My expectation was that this is going to be another restaurant. My hope was that, wow, this can really be something.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll make some money, can put something to retirement. I was a bit jaded at that point. When I owned my first restaurant, I was 20 years into the industry, 15 years in. I knew enough about it to be realistic about it. That was French Blue up in St. Helena in Napa Valley. Yeah, that was the first one. I was a partner. And
what year?
That was 2011.
Okay.
Yeah. And
right around when we met.
Yeah. Yeah.
You were opening your restaurant.
Yeah. And it was fantastic, right? All the joys that come along with it, owning a business, being responsible, but then you're responsible. We had $2.5 million of investor money that kept me up at night thinking, how are we going to pay this back? We had a staff of probably 60 people across the different shifts that if I made a mistake, they're not feeding their family. And that burden is always there with any business. In the restaurant business, because of how fickle customers can be, how thin the margins are, one mistake, 5%, that's not a lot of buffer. So one mistake and it can all go wrong.
Because you've seen so many restaurants
Yeah.
by the time 20 years in. So you see the numbers, you understand the skills, and you raise $2.5 million to do the restaurant. Did you have a vision? Say, I'm going to do this differently?
Absolutely. I had my own point of view on cooking. I had my own point of view on how we should present food to people, service, all of that. I also had partners who had their own vision and their own point of view.
Are they
right?
business folks? Or are they,
One was the builder and architect of the restaurant, and one was the front of the house. I was most certainly a minority partner, but the three of us put it together. We had some other core people that worked with us that came along, but the three of us drove it, and it was successful until it wasn't, right? One of the partners had some personal issues that ended up affecting the business, and it was heartbreaking because I feel like we were just starting to find our footing. We had a couple other deals that were on the table to open a couple more that someone wanted to invest and to really put the pedal to the metal. And then all of a sudden we're blindsided, right? And we had to sell the business as a result. And now I'm back at square one.
The philosophies that you went into building that business, did you realize some of those? Or
Yeah, I did. I have a very personal point of view on food. My cooking is been influenced for the most part by two main schools of thought. I started with Tracy in California, which was ingredient forward, right? It's about the raw materials. Everything is grown right around us and don't mess it up, right? Let it shine on its own. A beautiful peach doesn't need much, some olive oil and salt, and there you go. Now now you've highlighted it. The other side is New York, where things are as manipulated as can possibly be at the time.
Foams.
This is before molecular gastronomy, but also before the farm to table move hit this country. And so every box said grown in California that we would get. Farmers markets weren't necessarily a big thing yet because everything's coming from California, or they're shipping fish from France or whatever they're doing. The products aren't at their best because they've 3 days of shipping here and the fish is a day of shipping there. So you have to manipulate it a bit more to bring it out. And so it's a lot more kind of theory behind the concept of the dish. And so for me, I've put those two together in a way that I think really lets the ingredients shine. But instead of here's a roasted artichoke with a simple vinaigrette, which can be delicious, but there's not a lot of depth there, it's here's an artichoke that's been marinated and then we infuse it, then we grill it, right? And so it still looks very simple, but you've done a bit more without taking away its character or its kind of sense of self. And the sauce is maybe a little more than a vinaigrette. If it's appropriate, sure, something simple, but I can really build depth of flavor and build things a bit deeper that will highlight it without covering it up. And so taking the best of both worlds is what my cooking is.
did you carry that to the second restaurant too?
I did.
Is it the Hawaii one?
Yeah. I think my techniques are still the same, right?
Yep.
What has changed is my cooking has gotten more rustic in appearance and presentation wise. Here's the steak, it's grilled. Like I'm not going to cut it into a perfect cube. As I've gotten older, things that were important when I was younger, that seemed important, have fallen away to the things that really are. And I've gotten to more of a focus on what are the important things in my life. And I think with cooking too, right? That steak doesn't have to be a perfect cube.
Yeah.
Or that if that piece of carrot's not literally measured with a ruler next to the other one, like
That's interesting how McDonald's wants the same perfect fries, like the same length.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's so fake.
The same
right?
length.
It's so
Right,
fake.
right?
So
It's
fake.
fake.
Yeah.
It's such like perfection.
Yeah.
And actually, I think people are becoming more, I don't know, it's my own take, suspicious
Yeah.
when fruits that look exactly the same.
Yeah.
There's this sort of across disciplines, I think a push towards authenticity
Yeah.
and acknowledgement that nobody's perfect
Yeah.
and nothing is perfect. A chip nail polish was apparently in. I don't know nail polish,
It's
but
a manufactured
for a
chipped.
while I was
It's like
like, chip
distressed
nail
jeans.
polish.
Let's get started swinging this way now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a lesson there for folks thinking about how you lead. And I guess that leads me to my last question for you, which is, how do you want to be remembered? You talked a little bit about your philosophy as a chef.
Sure.
How do you want to be remembered as a cook and as a leader?
I'm not really interested in how people remember what I've made or the dish or the signature item that might have been on a menu. I want to be remembered for the way people felt, the way I've maybe helped somebody come along in their career. Certainly, if I've helped someone in my personal life, for me, those relationships are probably the most important thing at this point. Part of my journey, hopefully towards wisdom and still going there, is the fact that what's on that plate isn't everything, right? And when I was a cook coming up, it was everything. I was only as good as the last plate I put out. And that may be true in the terms of the product, but really it's the impression you make on people, and really it's the means by which you do that, and it's not the end in itself. So yeah, it's that kind of, that I've heard it called an infinite mindset that I try to have, and whether I'm successful or not, is that I want what I do to continue, and if someone I've worked with continues to lead somebody else and help them, then I'm happy.
The way you make people feel is going to propagate itself forward. The dish that you made perfectly is going to perish in the next 20 minutes.
It's ephemeral.
It's
right?
ephemeral. Thank you so much for
thank you.
sharing
It's
your
been a
home with
pleasure.
us.
Philip,
Yeah.
so much
I've
wisdom
enjoyed it.
here. And it's been such a pleasure.